Kristina Podesva is editor and publisher at Bruna Press. As an artist and writer, she works between experimental poetics and visual art and has edited several books and journals, including Nancy Holt Stone Enclosure Rock Rings, forthcoming from Bruna, Philip Magazine, Sir, Tradición versus Modernidad, Institutions by Artists, Volume 1, and 100% Vancouver. Her writing has appeared in exhibition catalogs, books, magazines, extensive publications, most recently in Swamps and the New Imagination with MIT Press. Podesva has taught at the California College of the Arts, San Francisco, Emily Carr University of Art and Design, Vancouver, among others. And she's currently adjunct instructor in art and art history at Western Washington University in Bellingham. I welcome KLP, the avatar of Kristina Podesva, to our virtual forum here. Hello, Kristina. And Kristina, before you get started, I'm informed that you can see us through a webcam that's pointed out at the audience right now. Is that true? And let's do a quick sound check before we get too far along. Kristina Podesva.
Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm going to now share my screen so you can see my slideshow. Okay, great, I am now. Thank you, Eden. And thank you also, Rebecca and Eden, for supporting this talk and organizing today's event, which is dedicated to Nancy Holt, a brilliant artist and one whom I believe is still very much undersung. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to get started. Let me move this out of the way. Oops. All right, so for one blurry instant, and from a particular distance, a curious low and circular stone dwelling seems to appear, set on the soft rise of a grassy slope with no roof to shelter under and no one home. Behind and above it, Douglas firs take up space. Hoary, buff, and copper-colored rocks give the impression that this is a structure ancient in origin, but it is too well kept to be a bona fide ruin. At a certain angle, the rocks on its face appear to follow the contours of 3 porthole windows and an archway bidding entry. What exactly is inside? To answer this question, we must accept the invitation of the apertures and get closer. From a bird's or God's eye view, Nancy Holt's sculpture Stone Enclosure Rock Rings allures, its archways opening the northwestern and southwestern arcs of its structure and cutting through the diameter of its 2 concentric stone circles, forming a passageway aligned with and oriented to Polaris, the North Star. Neither small nor colossal in stature, the sculpture seems just about the right size. For me, anyway, my arms being able to touch either side of an archway when I stand in its center. All told, Stone Enclosure has 4 arches, 2 at either end of its outer ring and 2 in the inner. And in each ring, 6 portholes interrupt its curving walls of stone at regular intervals. But where are we? And where is the sculpture? Situated in Bellingham, Washington, in the northwestern corner of the continental United States, the sculpture has stood for over 4 decades in the southeastern corner of Western Washington University's campus. As a standout among many works in the university's prestigious sculpture collection, and it is worth noting as the collection's first commission by a female artist, which the Art Acquisitions Committee at Western Washington University authorized. And so you can see it here pointed out by the purple arrow, number 11. And this is what the campus looked like in 1978. And south, by the way, is oriented at the top and north is down. During many sunny afternoons, one can observe almonds of light thrown against patches and parabolas of shadow made by the sculpture's walls, or hear a medley of bird song and wind song mixed with a strong perfume of the forest and a fainter one of the minerals of, in the stones and elements of the sea, Bellingham Bay being only 2 miles away. It is in this interpretive guise that the sculpture acts as a ring within ring reception room, open to all manner of visitation. solar, lunar, stellar, terrestrial, animal, botanical, aural, meteorological, social, cultural, or olfactory. But it's also a discursive structure as much as it is a receptive one, being in dialogue with the sculptures nearby and campus surrounding it, most especially Robert Morris's untitled steam work for Bellingham, its nearest neighbor. And you can see stone enclosure rock rings right behind the steam here. And here's a detail of Morris's piece with the context of the campus as it would have looked in the 1970s when Nancy Holt constructed Stone Enclosure. Stone Enclosure is also in dialogue with Wright's Triangle, a work by Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson's dear friend Richard Serra, a piece that, according to Holt's stonemason Al Pointer, magically appeared one day on campus the same year that Pointer had labored every day for 3 months and 2 seasons, from summer to autumn 1978, to erect Holt's piece. And it's also in contrast to Isamu Noguchi's sky viewing sculpture, which is located centrally on campus and which channels viewer attention upwards and skywards, rather than to the intimacies and immediacies of stone, campus, architecture, nature, and sculptures, as well as of the heavens. For Holt, the intended site of Stone Enclosure was a removed meditative space away from the university buildings, open all the way around except to the east, where there is a stand of tall firs. And actually, I don't know if you can see it here, but in the parking lot behind Stone Enclosure, there's a white Volkswagen van, and I believe that was Nancy Holt's van at the time. In 2018, I was approached by Hafthor Ingvason, director of the gallery and sculpture collection at Western Washington, to publish a book about Stone Enclosure and its related archives, supporting expansion of the ever-growing scholarship on Holt's practice. Among the many folders in the archives were documents detailing budgets, meeting minutes, and correspondence between the university and Holt, among others. After a careful review of this archive, 2 curious items drew my interest, including this graph or self-portrait made by Holt in 1972, and a tattered copy of an article she wrote and designed about the sculpture, which was published in the June 1979 issue of Arts magazine, and which included her own writing and photographs of the piece. Somewhat surprisingly to me, an interview between Holt and Al Pointer, the stonemason, also appears, making transparent the manual labor invested in this work, a striking departure from the opaque quality of labor that produced the works of Holt's friends, such as Richard Serra and Robert Morris, who are also represented in the collection at Western Washington. Inspired by Pointer, Holt had in fact expanded the title of her work to be Stone Enclosure Rock Rings, with the original title being simply Rock Rings. The reason for this change is hinted at in the Arts magazine interview, where Pointer observes that when a mason handles a rock, it becomes stone. While Holt is often claimed or categorized by the earth and land art movements, it is through my relationship to and sitting with Stone Enclosure that I've come to see her work constellated in many more genres and dimensions. Looking back at the arc of her work in an interview in 1992, she said that my art, if anything, is personal, and I'm always wondering why that term didn't have more cachet. And about Stone Enclosure specifically, she said, Rock Rings did accomplish something deep in my psyche. It was important work for me. It was something that I felt I needed to get out that was in me, and I had a very strong need to make that work. And then once it was done, I think I was able to move on from there to other things. So, who was this feminist artist and mystic, and in what ways did she relate to and understand Stone Enclosure through the many facets of herself? Well, for one, the project was her first permanent publicly accessible commission and represents a very complex, expansive, and nuanced conception of sight, where geographical place and cosmological space are interwoven, where we're not inhabiting some mere physical space vis-a-vis Stone Enclosure, but experiencing Holt's sculpture in a specific place in the space of the universe that equally transmits and receives, and that circulates within and encircles a plane which belongs to the universe and also this planet and also this campus. A place that is not only sensed but determined out of context, processes, conditions, and collaborations with men who make astronomical calculations or do rough stonework like Al Pointer, with heavy materials and traditionalist male trades, and who are overseen by a woman who successfully negotiates with university administrators and facilities departments and develops budgets while self-financing the production of her own work. A work which accommodates all students and visitors, and most importantly, the march of time and the many changes it carries with it. For Holt, time was a circle. Perhaps the circularity of it made for her a comforting figure, having lost both her mother and father only months apart when she was 24 years old, and then her dear husband and artistic partner, Robert Smithson, when she was 35. And then again, her close friend, Dennis Wheeler, who was featured in her video work Revolve, when she was not yet 40 and just beginning work on Stone Enclosure. The following year, in 1978, while she was overseeing the construction of Stone Enclosure, her only living relative, Aunt Ethel, became seriously ill and later passed. It's my belief that these early experiences of deep and personal loss are inextricably bound up with Holt's early work and concerns from 1967 to 1979, the year she published her article about Stone Enclosure in Arts Magazine, and then the following year she published Ransacked, her artist book about Ethel's final days. Thus, while Holt worked on Stone Enclosure both at its beginning and at its end, she was laboring under the strain of imminent loss of her dear friend Dennis and her Aunt Ethel. Having a terrible familiarity with loss by that point, my sense is that her sculpture at Western Washington meant something of great personal significance to her. Moreover, her works Revolve and Ransacked bookend Stone Enclosure, which means at the very least this period of her life was a difficult echo of earlier experience of tremendous loss. In an interview in 1983, Holt spoke of two works, Underscan and Ransacked, about Ethel's house, as allowing viewers to, quote, get very close to some very powerful, strong emotions by setting up a structure for people to feel the emotion without being overwhelmed by it. I could bring them closer by putting up a structure that would keep the distance. Somehow they could rest in my structure, end quote. At first look, Stone Enclosure rock rings may appear to be a simple structure, but its implications are much more complex, offering a space for enduring relations between sight and surroundings, the self and the stars, the earth and the heavens, labor and feminism, the living and the dead. And I am deeply moved by what it meant for Holt and what it means to me. In conclusion, I've only scratched the surface about this work, so if you're interested in learning more, please do look for our book, which will be published in April of 2022. And of course, the exhibition that goes along with it at Western Washington will be on view from January to May of next year. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking with you further.
Yeah, I was just saying that it sort of struck me with Wild Spot, but also I think it could apply to your to Stone Enclosure, the relationship to Sonfist's time landscape. He makes a lot of claims for what's going to live inside of that site, or what is contained by this very porous exterior, and yet, of course, like it kind of can't help but fail at that claim. That is that he, for those that don't know the piece, that he effectively claims it's a kind of pre-colonial garden that lives in the midst of Manhattan. And I think particularly the kind of creep or the visitors, I think is how you put it with the Stone Enclosure. There seems to be a kind of a similar kind of setup, but I don't know. I guess I'm curious how you understand what she feels like lives inside of these boundaries, or because they clearly demarcate something, but like, what are they demarcating exactly?
And we'll give that to Kristina first, and then Judy.
Okay, thank you. So I think what's amazing about Nancy Holt is that she never overdetermines what the viewer experiences. She gives maybe some parameters from what I can tell. And so she's open to all of this change. She knows change will occur, it's inevitable. And our attention is captured, you know, and our perception is captured while we are having a relationship with the forms that she develops. But yes, like if you go to Stone Enclosure, you will see all kinds of vegetation that's creeping through. You will find discarded joints. You will find garbage. You'll find face masks. You'll find all kinds of things. And when we interviewed Al Pointer in 2018, he told us that Nancy really loved that. She loved all the interactions that were very different that would occur with the sculpture. And so even when, you know, that university building that is now encroaching on the Stone Enclosure rock ring, which wasn't there when she cited it originally, you know, she was alive when that happened or when the plans were going forward for it. And, you know, she said, what will be in a sense. So I'm sure she wasn't thrilled to have that building encroaching on where the North Star would have shown up if you were standing in the sculpture. But at the same time, I think she had this kind of flexibility in the work. She knew that it would have to change. So I hope that answers something there for you.
Thank you so much, Kristina. And Judy, you also ended talking about shifts, if you might want to say a quick word.
There's this back and forth in Nancy's work. There's this back and forth between the natural and the constructed, and one really sees that in Wild Spot, that it isn't, the place itself isn't wild, as I pointed out. The indigenous garden was constructed. It took a lot of tending, that garden, and the college wasn't all that great about that, and so it had to get replanted at least once with perennials. Hopefully they were indigenous, but that were of lower upkeep, more kind of self-propagating and so on. So to keep the work, and the black fencing needed to be repainted a couple of times. So it's kind of a dance with time of maintaining the kind of the intent, but then allowing for nature to have the role it's supposed to of growing the plants, and then, as I point out, the new ring around the outside made by the path, because now the site of the Botanic Gardens is quite different from what it was. It's this very lush meadow instead of this golf green carpet. So it's a dynamic.
Really interesting comparison. We only have the ECE students, which we called Team Sparky back in our time together, for today's moment right now. So I'm going to prioritize a question for that group. And then we'll go to the break, but keep the conversation going. Dean Jenkins.
For you all who built electrical systems, I just wonder what you feel like your relationship with the artist is, and sort of like musicians, you're interpreting something someone else made, but what role did you have as interpreters of that work?
So to that, for me personally at least, I felt like our role primarily was to, I guess, sort of update the design, because electrical standards have changed, you know, if slightly, and this also isn't the exact same area that the original was in, and so the materials that are considered standard aren't necessarily the same. So I feel like our job in interpretation primarily was to adapt it to more, you know, the more modern standards and to this specific area and the way things are meant to work around here.
I agree. 100%, I agree.
Okay, well, with that note of consensus then, we are going to, and with apologies we couldn't get to all the questions, but we're going to try to stay on get back on schedule. I would like to heartily applaud and thank all of today's presenters, all of the efforts, all of the curatorial work, the labor, the research, the editorial work that stands behind what we heard today. Thank you all so much. We will reconvene at 3:45 for the next session. Coffee in the lobby, and see you back here in some minutes.